Hello and welcome to Changing World. My name is Anthony Smith and I'm here today with Dr. Arnold Zuboff, who is a former lecturer in philosophy at University College London. He also holds a PhD in philosophy from Princeton University in America, and he's here to talk to me today about his views on Brexit. Now, I know, Arnold, you have strong views on this subject, and you're kind of coming at this from a philosophical perspective, and it has to do with the original vote, which was made around about 2 years ago, back in 2016, I believe. Would you like to explain to the viewers exactly what your point on this is, and just let them know a little bit about how you came to arrive at this point and what the implications are?
Yes, thank you. I would say my view is not so much about Brexit, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. It's a view simply about the democratic significance of the EU referendum vote. I think almost everyone has made a big mistake in trying to understand what the people voted for.
Really?
Yes, it's a simple mistake. My point is in one sense neutral. It's a technical point.
Okay.
It's not a matter of political opinion at all. It doesn't enter into it at all. It's just looking carefully at what actually happened in the vote and how that ought to count towards determining what we're going to do. That's where the mistake was made.
Right.
An enormous, amazing mistake. I've never my whole life seen a mistake like this having been made before.
Really?
And yes, but I spent my career trying to help people think clearly. And this is the very sort of mistake I think I'm specialized in helping to correct.
Okay, so you obviously have an extensive background in philosophy.
Yeah.
You did a degree in philosophy. You also did a PhD. Could you obviously explain to the layman why you think a mistake has been made? I mean, what exactly would you say to explain this in layman's terms?
Well, I hope you don't mind if I do some reading on this because I've written it out.
Okay.
And I think this might be the clearest way of explaining it I could produce for you.
Sure. Okay, go ahead.
When I first saw the vote tally of the EU referendum, I could easily see its democratic import. It was obviously a mandate for leaving the EU but staying in the single market. Why? Well, the margin was close between leave and remain, and some fraction of those who voted leave must have wanted to stay in the single market, as in the Norway Brexit formula, which was much touted in the campaign. It was often being mentioned by Remain campaigners as part of what they claimed was the bewildering variety of possible Brexits, and at times it was actually promised to undecided voters by some prominent Leave campaigners because it made a Leave vote seem less extreme. Surely, therefore, only a minority of total referendum voters had wanted to leave the single market. If the Leave vote had been a lot bigger as a proportion, it could have been the case that a majority of total voters in the referendum had wanted to leave the single market. But that would have been most unlikely with the vote as close as it actually was. And then I was greatly surprised to hear hard Brexiteers claiming victory. How could only a minority of voters be thought of to have determined the mandate of a referendum? I started hearing plain falsehoods thrown around like, quote, the British people have voted for controlling immigration and leaving the single market, end quote. And strangely, these falsehoods went in substance unchallenged. People would oppose them merely with points about how staying in the single market would be better for people, even if they had voted against it, and with a sheepishly made technical sounding point that the choice between hard and soft Brexit hadn't been on the ballot.
Okay.
Nobody on either side of the debate seemed to recognize the democratic import of the simple truth that almost certainly a majority of referendum voters had not prioritized controlling immigration and had favored staying in the single market, and only a minority had favored hard Brexit. Yet nobody was directly denying this truth. It was not that hard Brexiteers ever explicitly indulged in the difficult claim that a majority of total referendum voters favored hard Brexit. So what was going on? After a while, I came to understand that the supposed mandate for hard Brexit was based on a simple logical mistake, a misconception of the vote that everyone on both sides shared. I began calling this mistake the referendum fallacy. If you Google that later, you can find a blog in which I wrote a lot about the subject.
Okay.
People were thinking of the referendum win as belonging to the hard Brexit majority within just the winning Leave voters, in place of its belonging to a majority within the totality of referendum voters. This twisted reckoning missed out all the force of the Remain vote completely. A moment's reflection shows that only a majority of the total voters can properly be counted as winning. Right? Not the majority of the winning Leave voters, but only of the total voters.
I see.
A majority within just the winning voters can still be a losing minority within the total voters, and in this case almost certainly was. Back in the late 70s or early 80s, a famous encyclopedia put out ads with the slogan, "You are never too young to start learning and never too old to stop." This was at the top of the ad in big letters. People were mesmerized by the pairings of young, old, start, stop. I had surprising trouble getting them to see the gross mistake here. Have you seen it? Let me read the slogan again.
Okay.
You are never too young to start learning and never too old to stop. It kind of sounds okay, doesn't it?
Yeah.
There's a gross mistake there.
Why is that?
You're missing. Okay. Instead of stop, it should have been continue. You're never too old to continue.
Okay.
Not to stop. It is nonsense to worry that someone might get so old that he could not stop learning. Oh no, I just keep learning and learning. Please help me to stop. Something similar is happening here. People on both sides are mesmerized into thinking most of the winning Leave voters having wanted hard Brexit is equivalent in force to most of the voters in the referendum having wanted hard Brexit. But that's mad. Most of the total referendum voters almost certainly wanted soft Brexit. And therefore, that's what a respect for democracy requires.
Okay. Right. Well, thank you for putting across your point of view on that, Arnold. I believe you had
Yes.
a kind of a diagram here that you
Yes.
wanted to show the viewers.
Yes.
Could you just explain what that's all about?
Yes, it's something like a cartoon.
All right.
Okay. And it shows what I'm talking about. If you look at that, let's see. Oh, thank you. Look at that bar. That represents the total referendum vote. Remain vote, you'll notice, is less than 50%. So the Remain lost. Right? Leave won. No doubt about it. But among the Leave voters, there were some who wanted a soft Brexit Leave. Didn't have to be too many for this. 2% would have been of total voters wanting to leave in a soft manner would have been enough. And, of course, some who did want a hard Brexit. Right? But as you can see, when you add together the Remain vote with the soft Brexit Leave vote, the hard Brexit Leave vote seems to be a minority among the referendum voters. How can the mandate be given to a minority? It's not democratic.
Right, I see your point. So, obviously, this is something which should be looked into. Was there something else that you had, a document there that you
yes, I did.
You wanted to go through and just
yes.
make a few points about this?
Let me get into this. I've actually sent this out to all MPs, and I've also sent it to a good number of people in the House of Lords. What it is a challenge to Jacob Rees-Mogg. And I've sent this to him. First I sent this to him. I waited a while, got no response, and then sent it out to all these other people as well. Here's my challenge to Jacob Rees-Mogg as delivered to him in an email message from me. Dear Jacob Rees-Mogg, you have said, quote, the UK will simply have to leave with no deal because the referendum result must be upheld. Democracy is the backbone of established political societies. It fosters stability and fairness and cannot be treated so disdainfully. End quote. Yet here's the truth about the democratic significance of the EU referendum vote. Leaving the single market would flout the will of the 48.1% who voted Remain, together with the surely 2% or more of referendum voters who voted Leave but favored the Norway option, or something relevantly similar. These were the majority of voters in the EU referendum, and the majority is supposed to win. It is irrelevant that a majority of the winning Leave voters may have favored a clean Brexit of the sort you would like if that majority was merely a minority of the total voters.
Okay.
That the British people voted to leave the single market is therefore simply false. There is no mandate for it. It would be clearly undemocratic. I challenge you, Jacob Rees-Mogg, to show that I am not right about this most important point regarding what respect for democracy in this case consists in. But before responding, as you must, if you really care about democracy, do first learn from the mistakes of John Redwood in his correspondence with me on this question. I have pasted that in below as a help. And here it is. A correspondence with John Redwood about the EU referendum mandate. Our correspondence started with a message that I sent to nearly all MPs. In it, I asked the reader to join me in pointing out to Mrs. May that almost certainly a majority of EU referendum voters favored either Remain or soft Brexit, and only a minority favored a clean Brexit. So here was the response I got from John Redwood to that email I sent out to nearly all MPs. So I'm quoting his message to me. Sent, by the way, on the 10th of February, 2018.
Okay.
He said, "What a silly email!" ! How can you know how many Leave voters wanted something we were not asked about? We were asked whether we wanted to leave or stay, and the decision was clear. So we must now leave. The official Leave campaign made it crystal clear we did not favor the Norway option, as leaving means no more payments to the EU. Okay, now here's my response to that. Dear Mr. Redwood, It is very good to have you admit at least that the EU referendum cannot be taken as a mandate for a clean Brexit. You say, quote, "How can you know how many Leave voters wanted something we were not asked about?" End quote. You must now share this crucial insight with the Prime Minister. She has based her policy on the mistaken belief that the British people voted against free movement and against continued single market membership. This was supposed to have been the democratic basis for closing down debate on whether the Norway option should even be considered. The official Leave campaign may, as you claim, have been consistent in opposing the Norway option. But how do you think this is relevant? Kate Hoey made a similar point to me in an email 2 days ago. Please allow me to paste in some of my reply to her. I said to her, I fully accept that in your campaigning you were clear on the point that you favored leaving the single market for the reasons you have given. Not all Leave campaigners were so clear, however, particularly those in UKIP, as will be proved below. Remember the crucial fact here, that all it would have taken to make referendum voters favoring a clean Brexit be the minority would have been just 2% or more of total referendum voters favoring something like the Norway option. Added to the 48.1% Remain voters, they would have been the majority. And in a proper democracy, a referendum majority outvotes a minority and determines the mandate. There were definitely Leave campaigners, not including you, who were wooing undecided voters by assuring them that a Leave vote was not risky because we would be continuing our membership in the single market after leaving. And many of these same Leave campaigners are shamefully now denouncing continuing in the single market as voter betrayal. Please watch them luring undecided voters here, and I gave a link to a video that shows Nigel Farage and others again and again saying we would stay in the single market after a Leave vote.
Yeah.
And here, read a UKIP description of this UKIP strategy, including a prediction that it would attract millions of undecided voters. And here's a link I put into my reply to Kate Hoey to an article on an online UKIP magazine that describes very convincingly how wonderfully attractive this soft Brexit option would be to undecided voters. In fact, makes it sound very good.
Mm-hmm.
But, this article's been removed since I started citing it to people. I have a copy, though, which I've sent out to every MP.
Okay.
And then I continue in my reply to Kate Hoey, saying, it really is urgently required that we wake people up to the undemocratic character of government policy. Just as Remain must concede that the referendum voters decided we leave the EU, those Leave politicians wanting a clean Brexit must concede that since almost certainly only a minority of referendum voters did favor that form of Brexit, going ahead with it would be undemocratic. I asked you, with great respect for you, to recognize your own responsibilities as an honorable Leave politician. ... That was the bit of my reply to Kate Hoey that I pasted into this reply to John Redwood.
I see.
Okay. And then here's John Redwood's response.
Okay.
Well, we know they voted to leave the single market and customs union, as both campaigns made clear that was a consequence of voting to leave! Okay. My reply to him. Perhaps then you made a mistake in writing in your previous reply to me, quote, how can you know how many Leave voters wanted something we were not asked about, end quote. You now want to say instead that we can know that nearly every Leave voter wanted to leave the single market as well as the EU. I sense that it makes you nervous to realize that you admitted in your last message that the vote was not a clean Brexit mandate. But you are obviously on the very shakiest ground now. My claim that this was a soft Brexit mandate required only that at least 2% of total referendum voters favored a soft Brexit, whereas your counterclaim that this was a hard Brexit mandate requires that nearly all Leave voters were against the Norway option. And on what do you base this? On both campaigns supposedly having made it clear that a Leave vote meant leaving the single market as well as the EU. Please allow me once again to do some pasting, this time from 2 messages I recently sent to you in which I addressed this kind of point. So I've given here 2 excerpts from previous emails sent out to MPs. Okay, here's the first excerpt. So this is me. But the leaders of both sides in the referendum campaign were clear, in some appearances on the Andrew Marr show, that we would leave the single market, I hear someone say. Whether this is meant to suggest that we are now somehow bound by what those leaders said then, or that voters must have been so influenced by such statements that none of those who favored the Norway option would have voted Leave, it is wide of the mark and desperate. First, the referendum was not a general election between parties running on binding party manifestos. It would be particularly odd to suggest that what even the losing leaders said would somehow now be binding on us. I mean, they make a big point of saying, oh, even the Remain leaders said that we would leave the single market, which I'll be looking at in a moment. That's supposed to bind us now? They lost the referendum. And during the campaign, the Norway option was often mentioned by both sides as a genuine Brexit possibility. Does anyone not remember all the talk from the Remain side about the allegedly bewildering array of Brexit options, always including Norway? Remember the look, you could do it this way, that way. Exactly. Yeah, we don't know what they're talking about. Did they ever during that say, but of course Norway is ruled out? No. Remain campaigners did, however, occasionally employ a tactic of making a Leave vote seem more extreme through baselessly asserting we would not be able to continue with our single market membership. Don't vote Leave because we won't have the Norway option. Why? They didn't give any real reason. This was part of Project Fear, right? So they were scaring people by saying we couldn't stay in the single market. But they had no reason for saying it. But Leave campaigners were often trying to make the Leave vote seem less extreme by saying that we would continue our membership in the single market. Did anyone hear them say, if you want to stay in the single market, you must vote Remain? No. Instead, some leaders of the Leave campaign promised undecided voters the same continued single market membership that they now shamefully denounce as voter betrayal. Here is conclusive evidence of them using this lure. And this is once again the link to that video showing the particularly UKIP but other Leave campaign leaders saying we would stay in the single market. And here's the second excerpt. I pasted in for John Redwood here about this business of all the leaders saying we would leave the single market.
Okay.
For God's sake, this is just elementary arithmetic and democratic theory. How can anyone on either side disagree with this or ignore it? Are we done? No. For now someone will pull out a red herring. We are told that lots, perhaps all, of the referendum campaign leaders made clear on the Andrew Marr show that if the Leave vote won, we somehow couldn't stay in the single market. Just the mention of this is meant to be enough to settle things. All the leaders said it. But how? Is it because what these people said on that show is binding on us now? Or is it rather that nearly every voter must have been watching, and so nearly all those attracted to the Norway Brexit option must have given it up and switched from voting Leave to voting Remain, or to not voting at all? Sometimes it suited Remain to say a Leave win would not allow us to stay in the single market, because that made a Leave vote seem more alarming. This was part of Project Fear. But it also suited Remain at other times, and indeed very often, to acknowledge the Norway Brexit option without any discounting of it, when Remain wanted to draw attention to the supposedly bewildering variety of possible Brexit choices. Can what either side, and especially the losing side, said in a referendum campaign be binding on us now? This was no general election with its party manifestos. What makes this a particularly malodorous red herring is its use by some of the former Leave campaign leaders. Of course, it's of no use now to former Remain campaign leaders who now think that we should stay in the single market after all. While the Remainers were trying to make a Leave vote seem more extreme by baselessly asserting that we couldn't stay in the single market if we left the EU, some of the Leave campaigners were wooing undecided voters by assuring them that a Leave vote was not extreme because we would be continuing our membership in the single market after leaving. These were some of the same Leave leaders who shamefully now denounce continuing in the single market as voter betrayal. Hold your nose and watch them luring undecided voters here. Once again, the link to that video. And finally, read a UKIP description of this UKIP strategy, including a prediction that it would attract millions of undecided voters, and that was the article that's now been removed. Here's closely related, distinct point that I'm making in this excerpt. In the last general election, both the Conservatives and Labour had pledged in their manifestos that they would respect the democratic decision of the referendum voters. And what was that decision? To leave the EU but stay in the single market. Okay, then, here we are. Then I had another reply from John Redwood. He said, "We voted to leave, not to have second thoughts or another vote." What? Whoever mentioned it. One of the few things all agreed on in the campaign was that leaving meant leaving the single market and customs union, which was asserted in the government leaflet sent to every home. There's no similar agreement or official leaflet about the Norway option, so you cannot possibly argue we wanted that! Exclamation mark. And here's my reply. I said nothing about second thoughts or another vote. I'm talking purely about the actual verdict of the 2016 EU referendum. Please keep properly in mind what we have been saying. Number one, I said in my original message that if at least 2% of total referendum voters in the referendum that we already had favored a soft Brexit, which was almost certainly the case, then the referendum voters favoring hard Brexit were a minority and therefore should not be awarded the mandate. Number two, you first responded that we couldn't know what the Leave voters wanted. Number three, then, presumably when you realized that this was giving up the referendum as a mandate for hard Brexit, you did an about-face and said that you actually did know what all, nearly all, of the Leave voters wanted. They all wanted to leave the single market. Number four, in your latest reply, apart from distractingly attributing to me points I did not make about second thoughts or another vote, you once again make assertions about how very clear it was to all the voters that the much-touted Norway option was not an option at all. It is on that alone that you would base the momentous claim that the referendum result was a mandate for hard Brexit.
Well, thank you very much, Arnold, for taking the trouble to explain in detail exactly what your views are. All I can say is it's a subject which you could talk about for hours and hours, and of course, there's continual debate going on all the time about Brexit, but unfortunately we have to leave it there. So I'd like to thank all our viewers for listening, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.